Instrumental conditioning, also known as operant conditioning, deals with how the consequences of our own actions influence how we behave from then on. So it's instrumental in that it can play a role in changing a person's behavior, and it's involved obviously in learning how to do things, in learning how to change something to improve it, and it can be very useful for those who work in education or even to motivate employees and in various other settings. So instrumental conditioning is basically always happening, just like classical conditioning is always happening. It's an everyday occurrence. There are three things that are important in using behavior modification. Behavior modification is just the intentional control of behavior using reinforcement or punishment. So if you're using it intentionally to try and change someone's behavior, to modify their behavior, then that's behavior modification. And we're going to focus on these three things, A, B, C, the antecedent of the behavior. So think of that as the setting the behavior occurs in, the behavior itself or the response that the person makes, and then the consequence of that behavior or response. And usually that consequence we can think of as a reinforcer or possibly a punishment. So we're going to use the following example. Joey is a child in the supermarket checkout line who nags his mother and throws a mini tantrum for candy until she gives him candy. So that'll be our working example. So let's first focus on the behavior. Any response is okay. Often it'll be something desirable or undesirable, like lining up quietly or hitting others, things that you want to encourage or discourage. So in Joey's example, what's the behavior? So take a moment and write down what you think the behavior is. Okay, so there's the example. All right, so if you thought about him nagging his mother and throwing a mini tantrum, that's what he's doing, right? So that's his behavior. And now let's focus on the antecedent. So this is the noun or an adjective. And so we're thinking about it as something that comes before or precedes in time or order, previous or pre-existing. And here's an example that they use for the sentence, the antecedent events that prompt you to break a diet. What's going on at the time when you break your diet? So we can kind of easily connect that then to Joey's example, right? What's going on? Where is he? What's happening at that moment right before he decides to start nagging his mom for candy and throwing a little tantrum? So what is the antecedent or setting for Joey? They're physically in the grocery store, right? But we might want to make that more specific because he doesn't throw a tantrum through the entire grocery store. It's only during the checkout where he's standing there probably bored and then there's a bunch of candy right there, right? So that's probably the best description of the antecedent or the setting for Joey. The setting can indicate whether or not a particular response will be reinforced. So we're going to look at how we can classify settings in one way or the other. When the occurrence of response is determined by the setting, so like the setting has a strong role in sort of bringing it out, we can call that a discriminated operant. The setting can be either an S plus, which sort of encourages the behavior by following it with reinforcement. So if the response is made in this situation, it's followed by reinforcement. And that's basically what happened to Joey, right? In an S minus setting, the response is not followed by reinforcement. So in a sense, it's discouraged by that setting. So if the response is made in this situation, it is not followed by reinforcement. So what type of setting is this for Joey? It's an S plus, right? So we can see that, okay, for Joey, the checkout aisle with all that candy there is definitely an S plus. What might be an S minus for him? Maybe a different kind of store that doesn't sell candy, could be the entry to the store as opposed to the checkout. So any other situation where candy would not be available or where his mother would not give him candy, that would be an S minus. And in those situations, he would probably quickly realize that no matter what he does, he's not going to get any candy. And so it would not encourage him. It would not motivate his behavior. And then finally, we can focus on the consequences. There are different types of consequences. And we're going to learn about reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement is just those things that we like, that we are going to enjoy. And so I'm going to make a little plus here, and that these are going to encourage us. And then punishment could be something that would sort of discourage a behavior, right? So maybe a minus here, that would minimize that behavior. So the plus makes the behavior more common, and the minus here indicates that a punishment would make the behavior less common. So let's take a look at how reinforcement and punishment can be categorized. So I'm going to make a 2x2 with 4 squares. And I'm going to label the top side here on the left as something is received by the person. In other words, something is given to them. On the right, I'm going to put down that something was instead taken away. And then on the left here, I'm just going to have 2 different categories. That item that's either received or taken away can either be pleasant or it can be unpleasant. So let's go through our 4 squares here and just sort of categorize these things. If a person receives something that is pleasant, that means we're here in this box, right? And that would be a positive outcome, right? If you get something that you want, that's something that is pleasant for you or desired by you. So we're going to call that positive reinforcement. Now let's go through these terms a little bit. I'm going to put a little smiley face here too, to remind us that this is something that we want. The word positive here comes from the fact that this is something that's received. And what makes it reinforcement is that it has a good outcome. It makes us happy. It's something that we want. That's what determines that it's reinforcement. So the word positive here doesn't mean that it's good in this case. It just means that the person is receiving something. So if we go over here to the right, where instead we can see that something is being taken away, we know that we're not going to use the word positive. So we designate the word positive to refer to cases where the person is receiving something, but we're going to use the word negative to indicate that something's being taken away from the person. Now in this case, if something that's being taken away from us is pleasant, we don't like that. So I'm going to make a sad face. And that is going to be an example of something that's not reinforcing at all. In fact, it's punishment. That'll be an example of negative punishment. And so we don't like negative punishment. So what makes negative punishment negative? It's not that it's unpleasant, it's that something is being taken away from us. Now let's go down here to this box, bottom left, and in this case, something unpleasant is being received or being given to the person. No, nobody likes that. We don't want to get unpleasant things. And so that's going to be an example of positive punishment. Now at first that sort of sounds like an oxymoron, right? It's a contradictory term, because how can punishment be positive? Now remember, the word positive here doesn't refer to whether it's good or bad. It just refers to whether something is being given or taken away. I did not invent these terms. I'm so sorry for them. They're not the easiest to remember. So it's important to remember that positive in this case, or negative, doesn't tell us whether it's good or bad. It's just telling us whether something is being given, in which case we use the word positive, or something is being taken away, in which case we use the word negative. Now, on the bottom right box here, we have a situation where something unpleasant is taken away. And I don't know about you, but I like that. So something that is unpleasant is being taken away. And so this can be something that we would call negative reinforcement. So what makes it negative? Again, not that it's good or bad, but that something's being taken away. What makes it reinforcement? It's that we like this. This is something we would want to happen because we want something unpleasant to be taken away. That means that there are two types of reinforcement and two types of punishment. So we have some choices here when we're thinking about using these as tools. So if we think of our reinforcements, a positive reinforcement is when you give something. It could be money, it could be praise, it could be a candy bar, anything like that, anything that the person would like. In contrast, a negative reinforcement would be anytime something is being taken away from a person that they don't want. We'd rather not have work, we'd rather not have exams, we'd rather not have chores to do. So those are examples of things that could be negative reinforcements. Maybe the highest selling employee on the sales force doesn't have to spend a few hours a week doing something that's kind of not fun, right? Like having to keep data on something or having to clean their workspace. So those would be kind of examples of a type of negative reinforcement. You can think of a teacher rewarding the class for doing really well in the spelling test by saying something like, no homework today. What's great about this? Is that you don't have to do something you'd rather not do. So that's negative reinforcement. In contrast, when we think about punishments, we also have the two types, the positive and the negative. And positive punishment, I'm going to put a couple exclamation points here, because remember, these are not positive, they're not good, and in fact, they're really bad generally. So not the best choice. Why? Just think about what happens with positive punishment. Someone is being given something they don't like. What could that be? Well, you're being yelled at. You're being made fun of. You're being slapped in some way. There's really not much I can think of in the realm of positive punishment that seems constructive or productive, and that wouldn't have a bad outcome in terms of the relationship with the person. So positive punishment, again, these two little exclamation points here saying, not the best choice. So instead, we're going to see that negative punishment might be a better choice here, because what's negative punishment? Something a person likes is being taken away. Okay, you're grounded. Maybe you lose points on an assignment if it's late. That could be an example of negative punishment, losing points. If you get a speeding ticket, you get a ticket, right? You lose money. So any kind of punishment like that where you lose something, you lose money, you lose some privilege you have or something that you enjoy doing, that would be an example of negative punishment. Of course, we don't like negative punishment, but can you see how it's a better choice than the positive punishment, where you are really antagonizing the person by perhaps yelling at them, saying something negative to them, or even perhaps physically harming them in some way. So negative punishment at least avoids some of those really relationship harming outcomes. So in terms of consequences, what was the consequence for Joey? Yeah, he got candy, right? So he was positively reinforced for nagging and for throwing a tantrum. So for a summary of ABC, we can see that we start with the behavior of interest, as we actually start in the middle with the B, Joey's nagging and tantrum. And then we can look at the antecedent. Remember, a more common word for that would be the setting. And then the consequence, what happens. And in his case, it was positive reinforcement with candy.